meine liebe Gäste. Wir freuen uns, Sie zuerst über die persische Literatur und Sprache begrüßen zu dürfen. Wir beginnen mit zwei Vorträgen von zwei Professoren, vom Professor Dr. Orthmann aus Berlin und Professor Dr. aus Teheran. Ja, genau. Und ich wollte ganz kurz was zu dem Ablauf der Vorträge sagen. Die Vorträge dauern hier 25 Minuten und dann 15 Minuten ist für Fragestellung und Diskussion vorgesehen. Zunächst darf ich Professor Dr. Orthmann begrüßen und sie wird über die grenzüberschreitende Einfluss des Persischen sprechen. Ich denke mal, oder Sie haben doch dieses Thema aktualisiert, also Sie wissen Bescheid. Sie geben davon. Ja, Professor Orthmann ist Professorin für Islamwissenschaft an der Universität Bonn. Ihre Forschungsschwerpunkte sind Wissenschaftsgeschichte und Geschichte und Kultur des Iran, Islam in Indien, Ethnologie und Stammesstrukturen in der arabischen Welt. Und wir freuen uns, dass Sie da sind und Sie haben das Wort.
Okay. So, thank you. Yes, indeed, I changed the topic of my talk because in the beginning, as you said, I am mostly working on Indo-Persian material. So a conference on Qajar period seems not to be so fitting to what I'm usually doing. But since I'm also working on the history of science, and in the field of history of science, there is indeed an interesting aspect with regard to what I'm interested in, and this is the history of astrology in Iran and also in India. So I decided to change the topic and to talk about, indeed, debates on astrology in late Qajar, Iran, which seemed to me more fitting to the general frame of this conference. I was not aware of the fact that there is a translation from Persian into German and from German into Persian. For this reason, I thought it might be most appropriate to speak in English for everybody to be able to follow, and I hope that will be the case. So now I'm speaking in English and will not change that anymore. So, before beginning, I would like to thank very much the organizers of this conference for inviting me. I think it's a very interesting event, and I think it's quite interesting to invite people from different countries to participate here. So, thank you very much for your efforts. So, now I will begin. Dear friends and colleagues, the takeover of science from the West in a Muslim world has been studied in depth for the beginnings of the Islamic centuries. I think I do not have to mention the translation movement and the enormous efforts to study Greek science in Abbasid times. A phenomenon still less studied until present is what we should perhaps call another translation movement, beginning in the 18th century and maybe continuing until today. That's to say, the tremendous efforts spent to catch up with European science in modern times. In spite of a few scientific contacts during Safavid times, European science and heliocentrism remained more or less unknown in Iran until Qajar times. As Kamran Arjuman has shown, the modern worldview was almost unknown until the reign of Nasiruddin Shah. This situation changed when in 1857, Ehtizad as-Sultana became Minister of Science. In that function, he struggled for the dissemination of European or Western science in his country. His attention was especially focused on astronomy. The propagation of a modern, heliocentric worldview went along with an oral and written campaign against astrology. The most prominent testimony of this struggle is his Falak as-Sa'ada, a treatise against astrology on 117 pages. The reign of Nasiruddin Shah and the efforts of his Minister of Science were extremely important for the modernization of Iran. It is, however, quite easy to imagine that the astrologers were not at all pleased by that development. polemics against astrology had, of course, been written in the Muslim world long before. Since astrology had been spread in the realm of Islam in the 8th century, critics had written elaborated treatises against this science, and some of their arguments were even taken over from antiquity. But this time the situation had changed. While before only the effects and the indications of the stars had been questioned or even ridiculized, now the entire cosmology was turned over, and the long-established geocentric worldview replaced by heliocentrism. This was an attack against the foundations of astrology. In addition to that, criticism this time came from the top, from the ruler's entourage, who usually were the astrologers' best clients. Quite often, rulers and astrologers lived in a kind of symbiosis, which was all of a sudden menaced. The new scientific developments did not only displease the astrologers, but also the clergy. Many mullahs rejected heliocentrism because it contradicted the traditional Aristotelian worldview. In this situation, mullahs and astrologers formed a kind of alliance against heliocentrism. In Shiism, such an alliance was, however, much less surprising than it might seem at first glance. I will come back to that later. The tremendous uproar caused by the dissemination of heliocentrism can only be guessed if we look at the amount of books and translations on astronomy and astrology produced in the second half of the 19th and at the beginning of the 20th century. Several dozens, if not even hundreds of manuscripts are listed in Monzavi's Fiqh al-Makhluqat. To study them would be a major project which will hopefully be done one day in the future. In my lecture today, I will just deal with a very limited number of these texts and will focus on astrology, not on astronomy, mainly because this is what I'm interested in, but also because Kamran Arjuman has already written about astronomy in a very interesting article on that topic. I will discuss 3 different treatises on astrology, representing 3 different approaches to the changing world view. The first treatise, Najm al-Hidayah, has been written by Muhammad Taqi Muhammad Hussain Kashani in 1883. A scholar well-versed in theology with some knowledge on natural sciences. The second is the just quoted Falak as-Saada by Etizad as-Sultana, and the third is a short treatise written by the Munajjim Bashi Abdul Jafar Najm ad-Dawla in 1872. Before turning to the texts, I would however like to give you a very brief introduction into traditional, that's to say Aristotelian cosmology. According to the Aristotelian worldview, Earth was in the center of the world and static. It was surrounded by the 7 planetary spheres, Sun and Moon being regarded as planets too. The sphere of the fixed stars and the so-called Atlas sphere were above the sphere of Saturn. This cosmological model went along with the idea that everything on Earth was composed out of the 4 elements fire, water, earth and air, which existed only in the sublunary sphere. The planets and stars were totally different from the material world. They were eternal and unchangeable. According to traditional natural philosophy, the role of the stars and planets was to cause the composition of complex bodies out of the 4 elements. Change in the sublunary world was caused by their movements. You can easily imagine that astrology had a well-established place in that system, and that even those who did not believe in prognostication usually did not doubt that the stars had an effect on Earth. It is astonishing to see that exactly this system was still prevalent in Iran until the middle of the 19th century. As it is evident from the writings of Muhammad Karim Khan, an eminent religious scholar whom I will mention later briefly, not only a geocentric worldview, but also the system of the 4 elements was still firmly rooted, with all its consequences for chemistry, medicine, etc. After this short introduction, let's now turn to our first text. As I just mentioned, The author of Najm al-Hidayah was a theologian. Besides his book on astrology, he has written several treatises on Shiite topics like Hidayat al-Shia or Wasilat al-Najah wa Tawdih al-Ayat. The text we are interested in was finished in 1883. The copy I used is rather a draft than a finished book. Kashani mentions in the introduction that the book has been written in great haste and urgency. In this case, the author's complaints are probably not only in introductory topos, but pressure and stress may well have been caused by the general situation of change and by Etezad as-Sultana's campaign against astrology. In any case, haste and urgency are clearly visible in the text. The copy is full of marginal notes, cross-outs, and lacunae. Right in the beginning, the author mentions 7 central questions he wants to deal with. First, is it allowed to practice astrology? Second, are there 7 heavens as taught by the Quran, or 9 as taught by some scholars? Third, is it possible to postpone death by prayer and by sadaqah? Fourth, why do all astrologers put the sun in the 4th sphere? Fifth, do the 7 planets really provide good and bad fortune? Sixth, what's the meaning of the Quranic verse according to which all the fixed stars are in the 1st sphere? And 7th, what's the point in the Ayam Ajuz, the old woman's day? In the list, we discover time-honored questions, but also new ones. Especially the 1st and the 3rd question had been discussed since long ago. Muhammad Kashani's answers also follow standard patterns. With more than 40 folio, the sheer scope of his answer on the 1st question is, however, remarkable. The author quotes from Quran and Hadith and refers to traditions from former Shiite scholars like Ibn Baboye, Al-Majlisi, Al-Naraki, and Shaykh al-Hayy. From these traditions, we learn that astrology is not only permissible, but even a blessed science. Of course, this positive view of astrology has not been invented by Muhammad Kashani, but had already a long tradition in Shiite Islam. The most famous book explicitly dealing with the advantages of astrology was Ibn Tawus' Faraj al-Mahmud, a book written to relieve the mind of those who are concerned about the allowed methods in astrology. Exactly like our 19th century text, Ibn Tawus' book contained a huge collection of traditions about the admissibility of astrology. By linking this knowledge with the prophets and the imams, it even became a quasi-divine science. Even inside the Shia, this view did not stay unchallenged. But at least in the uneasy situation created by the new heliocentric worldview, the sacred and prophetic character of astrology was again stressed to defend the old geocentric worldview against the proponents of heliocentrism. For our author never mentions heliocentrism verbatim, the scope of traditions he quotes hints at the menace to astrology and the Aristotelian worldview. This menace becomes more evident in the author's dealing with questions usually not dealt with in treatises on astrology. The number of the spheres and the position of the sun. Without mentioning opposing views, Muhammad Kashani just states that all astronomers agree about the existence of 9 spheres. You can only guess that this was not the case anymore in his time, when he writes at another place, modern scholars have added other partial spheres we do not want to discuss here, because it is not suitable to do so in this treatise. To confirm his position, the author is exclusively referring to Quran and Hadith. Natural science is not even mentioned. His argumentation is nevertheless interesting, because even the position of the sun in the 4th sphere and the division of the planets into fortunate and unfortunate ones is referred to the prophets and the Ausseer. From the writings of Muhammad Karim Khan, another religious scholar contemporary to Muhammad Kashani, we learn that our author was not just a single case, but answer for positions widespread within the clergy. For Muhammad Karim Khan, astrology is knowledge about all beginnings and all ends. It comprehends all ordinations and assumptions, and it's the knowledge of the prophets and the envoys and those who are close to God. The new astronomic ideas are criticized by him because they are just opinions and isolated teachings, but don't form a mazhab. A mazhab, that's to say a complete and comprehensive worldview, was only provided by the old system in which astrology was firmly rooted. In conclusion, we understand that in this situation of change, religious support for astrology became even stronger than before, religious scholars defending it because they regarded astrology as a cornerstone of the Aristotelian system. Let's now turn to our second book, Etezat as-Saltanas Falak as-Saada. In consideration of the religious scholar's attitude, we do not wonder about the second chapter of his book being dedicated to religious traditions against astrology. As just mentioned, a quasi-divine position was attributed to astrology only by one part of the Shiite scholars, while others, like Sayyid al-Murtaza, refuted it. In his treatise against astrology, Etezat as-Saltana therefore especially stresses Sayyid al-Murtaza's most famous critics on astrology, and I'll quote that here. Imagine a road full of deep holes, and imagine many people walking along this road. Some of these people are blind, while the others have good eyes. In this situation, we expect that most of the people who fall into the holes are blind, while those with good eyesight avoid the holes and escape the danger. But this is not the case, and they all fall in the hole in the same frequency. The blind people in this parable are those who ignore astrology, while those with good eyesight know it. The parable symbolizes that in real life, those knowing astrology and those ignoring it are equally tempted by calamities. There is therefore no use in astrology. By far more interesting than the second chapter is, however, the first chapter of Falak as-Saada, in which Etezat as-Saltana deals with rational arguments against astrology. The chapter is an interesting mixture between traditional arguments and new ones. On the traditional side, Etezat as-Saltana especially refers to Al-Farabi and his Fi Ibtal Ahkam an-Nujum, a widely read and widely used treatise against astrology. In between his new arguments, we find references to the existence of other planets and moons, the planetary movements according to the new model, gravitation and the flood, and comets and meteorites. Let me just briefly consider the background of these arguments. The first two arguments refer to traditional astrological doctrines, like the relations between planets and zodiacal signs, or the attribution of specific effects to the retrograde movements of planets. And I show you just a very brief overview in which the attribution of zodiacal signs to planets can be detected in the two innermost yellow circles. The discovery of new planets posed a problem insofar as the zodiacal signs had already been distributed to the hitherto known planets, with no sign being left for the newly discovered ones. The new calculations of the planetary orbits was even worse, because it invalidated the ancient theory of retrogression, to which much evil had been attributed in astrology. The third argument aimed at the empirical justification for astrology. To better understand this argument, you have to know that astrology was considered an empirical knowledge similar to medicine. Its rules were not deduced by logic but acquired by experience. Based on experience, the existence of tide and flood has since long been attributed to the effect of the moon. Together with the effect of the sun, proven by the change of the seasons, tide and flood were thus taken as a clear proof for the existence of astral effects on Earth. Tide and flood were so important in the astrologer's argumentation that Abu Masha the famous astrologer of the 9th century, dedicated a long chapter of his introduction to astrology to the description of floods. I don't know that the moon had indeed an effect on Earth, but that this effect was caused by gravitation defeated one of the astrologer's main proofs for astral effects on Earth. Al-Tizad al-Sultana's last point, the existence of meteorites and the possibility to calculate a comet's orbital, was even worse, because it undermined one central point of the Aristotelian worldview, the separation between the sublunar sphere and the upper spheres of planets and fixed stars. Because of this separation, comets could not pierce the lunar sphere. They were therefore considered to move only in the sublunar sphere according to uncalculable rules. A demonstration of the comet's movement in and beyond the planetary spheres that proved the untenability of this separation theory. The same was true for the meteorites, because according to Aristotelian teachings, only the sublunar sphere was made of ordinary material, while the upper spheres consisted of the so-called fifth element. Meteorites, however, resembled very much what was to be found on Earth, and therefore proved that the material world was one and the same on the Earth and beyond. We thus understand that Al-Tizad al-Sultana's book was not only directed against astrology, its aim was to upset the ancient Aristotelian cosmology. This was an important difference between the introduction of heliocentrism in the West and in Iran. While in the West, the Aristotelian cosmology only crumbled away slowly with one important discovery after the other, in Iran, the entire system was upset at once. We can easily understand that this caused much resistance. Al-Tizad al-Sultana himself mentions this resistance in his remarks about his activities and his effort to abolish astrology and to spread the new worldview. I quote, "When at that time I was ordered by the ruler in Tabriz to establish the telegraph line, I realized that stories about my struggle against astrology were well known at every place. When the royal court had been in Qazvin and Zinjan, I had many discussions with people from there and had told them that the calculation of an eclipse is different from a judgment about the beginning of the rainy season. Information about the lunar crescent visibility is also different from such about prevailing catastrophes or future fame. Some of the people accepted my arguments, but most of them kept silent." We further learn that while in some parts of Iran, Al-Tizad al-Sultana was very active in his campaign against astrology, in others, he rather kept silent because the local governor strongly believed in astrology. According to Al-Tizad al-Sultana, Nasir al-Din did not believe in astrology. His minister therefore even compares him with Aurangzeb, who allegedly abolished astrology in the Mughal Empire. In any case, Nasir al-Din Shah took one important measure to restrict astrology. He forbade the printing of marginal notes in the almanacs, the taqawim. Obviously, astrological prognostications were not included in the body text of an almanac, but were added on its margins. The imperial order was thus meant to forestall the inclusion of astrological prognostication in those calendars. Interesting enough, we learn from the last manuscript I would like to present to you that later on the printing of almanacs even became an exclusive right of the Munajjim Bashi. This obviously caused much inquiry, which is reflected in Najm al-Dawla's short risala named Rati Yeki as Munajjimi. Abdal Rafa Najm al-Dawla, the Munajjim Bashi, is not a total stranger. By the order of Al-Tizad al-Sultana, he had in 1865 composed the first official treatise on modern astronomy, the Kanun-i-Nasiri. He thus had not only a broad knowledge of the heliocentric worldview, but was even one of its proponents. We would therefore expect his treatise to be against astrology. But the matter was more complicated. As we learn from the prologue, Najm ad-Din felt obliged to write his treatise because other astrologers had questioned his astrological qualifications. Their criticism has not been preserved, but we may deduct their reproaches from Najm ad-Din's answers. The first accusation concerned an allegedly wrong appointment for the zafaf, the transfer of the bride to her husband's house. The appointment of the right moment for a specific action, the so-called ikhtiyarat, was one of the principal activities of an astrologer. In spite of his astronomical knowledge, Najm ad-Dawla was thus still an active astrologer. The scope of his knowledge can be understood from his defense, where Najm ad-Dawla refers to respected authorities in the field of astrology and legitimizes his appointment for the zafaf by traditional astrological rules. The second reproach was of a more general character, saying that Najm ad-Dawla used to appoint the zafaf in such a way that it best fitted a wedding celebration. In his answer, Najm ad-Dawla gives again proof of his deep knowledge of astrology. After discussing different astrological aspects of the zafaf and the appointment of the right moment for it, Najm ad-Dawla turns against his critics and reproaches them to pay too much attention to astral influences. The fate of a marriage and its fortune, he concludes, do not depend from the stars alone, because they interfere much less in human affairs than the astrologers assume. Najm ad-Dawla was thus an astrologer who did not want his knowledge to be called in question. He even emphasizes his competence by quoting traditional astrological judgments. At the same time, however, he limited the astral influences. Later in his book, in the context of a rival's prediction of war, Najm ad-Dawla gives further information on his attitudes towards astrology, and I quote again. You may obtain such results from astrology, but only in a general way, not in such details. That's to say that it is not possible to find out the date, the place, and the manner of a war, and the methods to improve the relation of the enemies in that detail. Najm ad-Dawla did thus not reject astrology in total, but conceded it a certain validity. Such an attitude is only at first glance surprising for a man with good knowledge of modern astronomy. In Europe too, when the modern astronomic worldview slowly developed during the 17th century, even such eminent scientists as Newton, Galilei, and Kepler did not challenge astrology in principle. In the case of Najm ad-Dawla, however, this ambiguous attitude towards astrology went along with economic interests, which may have caused his prevailing inclination towards astrology. As he writes in the introduction to his treatise, he was forced to write this text by people who, because of their own low income, search for the other's piece of bread. We understand that Najm ad-Dawla meant by these people persons who printed almanacs, rakawim, a privilege accorded to Najm ad-Dawla and his family in 1862. Obviously, the interdiction to print almanacs was not effective. At the end of our text, Najm ad-Dawla therefore formulates his deepest wish as follows. Hopefully, the high officials will again decree that such false astrologers have to keep away from the printing of almanacs. We are probably not wrong in assuming that the privilege of printing almanacs meant a substantial financial advantage for the chief astrologer. Modern scientific findings, traditional astrological convictions, and economic interests together thus determined Najm ad-Dawla's worldview. He is an interesting person just because of this mixture, demonstrating that the perception and acceptance of new scientific results is to a certain extent influenced by own, sometimes very material, interests. To conclude, the three different texts show different approaches to the new heliocentric worldview. It is interesting to see that though the introduction of heliocentrism obviously caused a lot of uproar, reactions were less intense than in Europe. You did not risk being executed for putting the sun in the center of the world. I have two explanations for this difference. First, the new world view did not develop slowly, but came to Iran as a well-developed system. It was not anymore a hypothesis, but well proven. The evidence for heliocentrism was thus so overwhelming that even those closing their eyes had difficulties in refuting it. Second, geocentrism was not so deeply rooted in Islam as it was in Christianity. Questioning the central position of Earth in Christianity was perceived as a direct threat to the biblical cosmology. I have the impression that this was less the case with Islam. Although there is some evidence for the existence of 7 heavens in the Quran, which thus shows some affinity to the Aristotelian worldview, we also find other traditions, putting the fixed stars, for example, all in the first sphere. These other traditions were later used to adopt heliocentrism, saying that heliocentrism actually is what the Quran is talking about, and that we just did not understand it correctly before. The new worldview thus became an Islamic worldview. At that moment, the alliance between theology and astrology lost its importance. Astrology was not any longer needed as the cornerstone of the God-given Aristotelian system, but became a relic of former times in a new world order based on heliocentrism and approved by the Quran. Thank you.
Now we change the language in German. Und vielen Dank für Ihre informativen und sehr interessanten Vortrag. Und wenn Sie Fragen haben, dann Sie können gerne eine Frage stellen. Und ich bitte Sie darum, dass Sie auf diesen Mikrofon drücken, damit Ihre Fragen übersetzt werden. Ja?
Ich habe eine Frage, und zwar vor der steht, Heliocentrism is less rooted. Sie meinen wahrscheinlich Geozentrismus, oder?
Oh, sorry, yeah, this is geocentrism, yeah. Oh. Sorry, this is a mistake. Thank you. I didn't realize that this, of course, has to be geocentrism.
Ja, Sie haben Geozentrismus.
Ja.
Und noch weitere Fragen? Kommentare? Wenn nicht, dann fangen wir also nochmal. Ja, Sie haben, gerne.
Ja, es hat ja auch Zeiten gegeben, in denen man sehr eifrig aus dem Persischen oder aus dem Arabischen übersetzt hat. Ich denke jetzt nicht an die ganz frühe Zeit, sondern an die Mongolen-Zeit, an die Schule von Marogay, die dann später nach Tabriz weiter gewandert ist. Und ich bin überhaupt kein Wissenschaftshistoriker, aber ich habe bei einer Tagung darüber teilgenommen und habe dort eigentlich gelernt, dass es da eigentlich ziemliche Herausforderungen gab, das geozentrische Weltbild betreffend. Und frage mich, ist das einfach vergessen worden?
Ja, also, soll ich auf Deutsch antworten? Ja, dann antworte ich auf Deutsch. Also tatsächlich spielt die Schule von Maragha eine sehr wichtige Rolle für die Astronomie. Es geht eigentlich in der Schule von Maragha, also das grundsätzliche Problem ist, wenn man mit einem geozentrischen Weltbild arbeitet, hat man Schwierigkeiten, die Planetenbewegungen korrekt zu beschreiben. Und ein ganz großes Problem besteht vor allem darin, dass nach Aristoteles diese Bewegungen perfekt sein müssen und deswegen rund. Sie sind aber, also sie sind nicht rund, sie sind Ellipsen. Und um das irgendwie sozusagen die theoretisch angenommene Kreisbahn mit den beobachteten Abweichungen, die sich aus der Ellipsenbahn ergeben, in Verbindung zu bringen, hat man im Laufe der Astronomie, besonders in der islamischen Welt, ganz verschiedene, also sehr komplexe Modelle mit Exzentern und Epizyklen und frag mich nicht was noch allem. Und als ganz besonderen Eckpunkt noch das sogenannte Pussy-Pärchen entwickelt, oder das Pussy-Paar, Pussy-Couple, mit dem man diese Verschiebungen erklären konnte, ohne sich von dem Modell der Kreisbahn verabschieden zu müssen. Es ist relativ wahrscheinlich, oder es wird angenommen, dass die Modelle, die man in Marara entwickelt hat, dann in Europa rezipiert worden, weil es zwischen den Zeichnungen, die man aus Marara kennt, und denen, die man dann bei Kepler findet, auffällige Ähnlichkeiten gibt. Den Schritt sozusagen, die Sache umzukehren und zu sagen, verstehe ich ja gar nicht im Mittelpunkt, den ist man aber nach allem, was man weiß, oder zumindest was ich weiß, in Marara nie gegangen. Wobei man eben sagen muss, wir verbinden die Keplersche Revolution, um das mal so zu nennen, immer mit der Veränderung des geozentrischen in ein heliozentrisches Weltbild. Tatsächlich gehört eben noch mehr dazu, und das ist nur einer der wichtigen Punkte. Ein ganz anderer wichtiger Punkt ist eben zum Beispiel auch diese kreisrunden Bahnen aufzugeben, mit denen man das Erstaunliche ist, dass man es in der islamischen Astronomie geschafft hat, alle diese Abweichungen durch immer komplexere Modelle zu erklären, die aber eben falsch waren. Man muss eben die Kreisbahn aufgeben und zur Ellipse kommen, um es wirklich erklären zu können oder viel einfacher erklären zu können. Und diesen Schritt ist man nicht gegangen. Man hat nur sehr viele sozusagen Modelle entwickelt, auf denen man dann aufbauen konnte, um das dann in Europa weiterzuentwickeln.
Wenn Sie keine Frage gibt, dann ja, vielen Dank. Ja, als nächste Referenten darf ich Herr Professor Dr. Seyed Bildungsarbeit begrüßen.